My name is John Lobell. I teach architecture at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York. I blog at creativitydiscourse.com, review movies from a mythological point of view at cinemadiscourse.com, and you can reach me at johnlobell@mac.com. This is a lecture for an Adriatic cruise on the art and architecture of Venice. So let's pull way back for a very large picture. Looking at the Eurasian continent, we see from the left the West, and then that's Western European, then ancient Greece, Middle Eastern, India, and on the right, China. So I've highlighted two of these, and we're going to be looking at Western art. So let's just do a quick contrast between the art of the West, with its emphasis on the individual, and that of the Far East, in which the individual and the architecture are subsumed into nature. So on the left we have Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa. This one has been digitally restored to the colors that it probably had before it has badly faded. And on the right, a Chinese painting, and there are people in that painting, but they don't pop. We don't see them right away. They are blended into and integrated with the landscape, in total contrast to the approach in the West, in which the Mona Lisa is forward and dominates the landscape, which is miniaturized into the background. And another contrast between medieval and Renaissance. On the left is a medieval Italian painter, Cimabue, with a Madonna and Child. And here the figures are not fleshed out, not rounded out, and are not set in a natural space, but the gold background gives them a spiritual space in which they are set. On the right is a Renaissance painting by Raphael, and the mother and child are quite fleshed out, somewhat realistic, and are in a natural setting, a natural landscape. So this is going to be characteristic of the art that we will be looking at in Venice. Also, to continue to orient ourselves, this is an early Renaissance painting, Fra Angelico, an Annunciation, and the figures are static, not really in action, not showing emotion. Then we get to the High Renaissance. This is Michelangelo, one of the Sibyls from the Sistine Chapel ceiling. On the right, on the left, a study for it. Michelangelo famously used young men for his studies for women's anatomy because the muscles were more clear. And so here we see a more sculptural, dynamic, anatomically rich quality in the High Renaissance painting. In mannerism, we work within the classical tradition, but play games with the rules. So this is Madonna of the Long Neck by Piemaggiuro. We see the exaggeration of the height of the figure. The neck is abnormally long, the figure is abnormally tall, the baby is distorted because it's a play between the dead Christ and the baby Jesus, and the angels on the left, if that's what they are not really put together right. So in mannerism, we play games with the rules. And then in the Baroque, there's an exuberant, emotional, erotic quality here in Bernini's Santa Teresa in Ecstasy. And then finally in Rococo, which we won't be seeing in the Venetian painting, but just to sort of round out the arc, there's an erotic frivolity, a decorative quality to the painting. So, our key Venetian painters, early masters of the early Renaissance, the Bellini family, Verini family, and Giorgione. Then in the High Renaissance, and Mannerist, we get a group of painters referred to as the great rivals, Titian, Tintoretto, and Veronese. Then with Tiepolo, we have the Venetian Baroque, and then we'll look at some scenes of Venice in Canaletto and Guardi, and then the darker side of Venice in Piranese's prisons. So, here's Viverani and Bartolomeo. An early Renaissance painting. We see there's some medieval quality. It's in a gold spiritual space. There's some landscape in the background, but really not fleshed out. The figures are rather static and don't really have an interior emotionality. So we are coming out of the medieval into the early Renaissance. Also in the early Renaissance, Giorgione, The Tempest. Nobody knows what this is about. We've got this nude nursing woman, to the left a soldier, a town in the background with a storm. Richly interesting painting, but no one has the vaguest idea what it's about. And then the three most important Venetian painters, they were great rivals, commenting on each other's work and often competing for the same commissions. And they're known for the Venetian style of loose technique, rich coloring, and often sensuous subject matter. Titian, Tintoretto, and Veronese. Titian lived a long time. His years pretty much overlap Michelangelo's. We can see here sort of the Venetian answer to the Roman painters, Roman artists. These sensuous scenes, lower right, biblical scene, but the rest are from classical imagery. We have a Venus and Mars. We have Zeus as a bull abducting Europa. We have a Venus played against a courtesan. And we see here in contrasting the figure to a Michelangelo, Michelangelo's is more muscular, more sculptural. Of course, he was a sculptor. And Titian's more painterly, more sensuous, more subtly colorful. Subtle play with the colors, as opposed to the bold colors in Michelangelo. One of his most famous paintings, Danae and the Shower of Gold, and Zeus seduces all these women as a swan, as a bull, here as a shower of gold, and her maidservant is, whoa, let's collect some of this. Now this is before mechanical or electronic or whatever reproductions, so that this painting was immensely popular and he made many versions. Tintoretto is a Mannerist. We see that here in the kind of stark, distorted perspective. This is the St. Mark's body being brought to Venice. Since it was, at this point, 1,500 years old, it probably didn't look that good. But this is a painting, so. A Veronese, here, the Mannerist quality of the colors, this rich, exaggerated coloration. And then the Venetian Baroque. This is Tiepolo, and here we have the full Baroque. He has a unique luminosity, and he's considered the last of the Olympian painters of the Venetian Republic. So here's the triumph of Zephyr and Flora, and we zoom in and see this energetic quality, cherubs flying around with these are fairy figures from a ballet. The ballet done at this time pioneered using wires to lift women up onto their toes, began toe dancing in ballet. Here is the allegory of the planets and the continents, and these are typically ceiling paintings, rich with clouds and figures, and then looking up at these figures in the sky or in the ceiling. One of the most famous Venetian painters is Canaletto, and he did views of Venice which were extremely sought after. So this is already, we see the Grand Tour, people from the rest of Europe traveling, typically throughout Italy, to see the classical scenes that they had studied about, ancient Rome, Renaissance Rome, and they would go to Venice, and you would want souvenirs from your travels. And if you were wealthy, like Catherine the Great, you would want paintings by Canaletto. And so here are some of his scenes, and we look at these, and this is exactly what we see today. So Venice has been wonderfully preserved, but we also see the rich, should we say, let's not say, photographic quality of the paintings. And we'd say, well, that's how we see it. Well, maybe in part we see it because this way because we've seen these paintings. These paintings have invented the way we see these scenes. More scenes. Here's Piazza San Marco. One of the churches we'll be looking at when we look at the architecture. And then Guardi, a competitor of Canaletto's, doing similar scenes. What's the difference we see here? More impressionist and more cloudy skies. Which leads us to the issue of the light. So the quality of light is often what's captured by a painter, what inspires painters. It's very much a function of the moisture in the air. So upper left, we're in Egypt, almost no moisture, extremely blue sky, very crisp quality to the scene. Lower left, we're in Greece, bit more moisture in the air, wisps of clouds. Upper right, Venice, rich moisture in the air, giving a more mottled quality of light, and then very famous foggy London with a whole other quality of its own. Now, another Venetian figure responsible for the quote-unquote postcards of the day is Piranesi. Piranesi was born in Venice, but spent most of his life in Rome. So if you were on the Grand Tour and you went to Rome, you would return with Veronese prints, so he would engrave copper plates. They could then be coated with steel so that many, many copies could be made. And if you travel in England and you visit the stately mansions, you'll often find Piranesi prints on the walls. So this is one of his scenes of Rome. But then at one point in his life, he returned to Venice to do what's called the carracci, or prisons. And they're imaginary spaces, very influential on modern architecture in terms of the rich dynamic of the space. Look at how it goes back, 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 in a very unsymmetrical, complex way, characteristic of modernism. And now the architecture. Let's first set the major styles. Here we are in Turkey at the Hagia Sophia, and this is an example of Byzantine architecture. So when we are thinking Byzantine, we're supposed to read out the minarets. They were added later after the Ottoman conquest, and it was converted to be a mosque. Here's an interior. In the 1930s, it then stopped being a mosque and became a museum. With Byzantine, we have the issue of the pendentive. How do you put a round dome on a square base? And it's done by a second dome, which is put down first. So in our diagram on the right, we start in the upper left, put our dome down, and then slice it off to make it square, leaving what's called the pendentives, and then the second dome goes on top of that. We see a full diagram on the left, and that's what we're seeing when we look up at Hagia Sophia. You can see the triangular pendentives and then the dome above being round and the floor square. We can see that on the plan on the lower left, the round dome set on a square base. With Romanesque architecture, in the sequence of European history, it comes later, from about 1000 to 1200, and then we get Gothic. So Romanesque is a lot like Gothic, but it's simpler, less ornamented, and the arches are round instead of pointed. With Gothic, it's more exuberant, more decorative. We have pointed arches. Now, we have the rich complexity of the structure, which involves flying buttresses, a whole other discussion. When we see Gothic examples in Venice, they're not going to be structurally what we understand to be Gothic. They're going to borrow some Gothic motifs as ornament. There's no way they're going to build real Gothic structure in the marshes of Venice. Then the Renaissance is Bramante's Tempietto, more sculptural, a revival of classical styles, the columns of Greece and Rome, the domes of Rome. And then the Baroque, here we are in Rome, with a constant play of concave and convex, a rich emotional quality and a very dynamic play to the architecture. So, in Venice, in the Palazzo Falier, in the mid-1200s, we're going to see a palazzo that is an example of Romanesque. Plain, simple facade, done in brick, rounded arches. Here in Cadoro, we have Gothic, rich ornament, and our pointed arches. Now, the structure of this facade is going to be the same as one we saw before and ones we'll see later. So the Gothic is simply the way it's ornamented. It's not Gothic construction the way it would be in France. And then Renaissance in the Palazzo Romani. Do we see the columns from ancient Rome? Another Renaissance palazzo, maybe hinting a bit at the Baroque. Now, in the churches, St. Mark's Basilica is Byzantine. It's built over a long period of time. We see styles from many periods, but when we look in on the right, we see St. Mark's and we see the pendentives, the round dome and then the triangular pendentives, bringing it down to a square base, except there's 5 domes instead of the 1 that we see in the Hagia Sophia. Here is a Romanesque church, Santa Maria a San Donato, and see the plainness of the brick facade. He said, well, it wasn't finished. They would have decorated. No, that's how they wanted to do it. There's very austere, plain quality to this period, to the spirituality of this period. See the round arches, not pointed. So these are characteristics of Romanesque. Here is a Gothic church, Basilica de Santa Maria, and it doesn't have flying buttresses, does not have an elaborate structure. It just has some Gothic motifs, the pointed arches, the rose window. And then Renaissance or even Mannerist in Palladio's San Giorgio Maggiore, and we'll look at that again in a minute when we focus in on Palladio. And then Baroque in Santa Maria della Salute, built in celebration of the end, or thankfulness for the end of a plague. We see the rich dynamic sculptural quality of the Baroque. Now, when we spoke about Venice earlier, we saw the coming of its loss of dominance as a sea power. So on the lower left, we've got a map. Here's the lagoon that Venice is. On the lower left, we have a map. Here's the lagoon that Venice is positioned in. And then look at all that green surrounding it. And then look at the mountains above that, which is going to tell us we're going to get a rich drainage of water into all that green. In other words, incredibly fertile farmland. So, with the Ottoman Empire expanding and other neighbors turning against Venice, eventually they're defeated as a sea power, and they turn inward to that green area, which is known as the Veneto, of Verona and Vicenza being among the key cities there. So this is low-lying land, and they're able to use their engineering to reclaim it through drainage and become extremely prosperous farmers. The key architect for many of the villas that these farmers build is Andrea Palladio. Palladio wrote a book called The Four Books of Palladio, and was owned by everybody. So, well, we'll see who everybody is in a minute. So, as a result, Palladio became an extremely influential architect. He's sometimes seen as one of the most influential architects of all time. This is the Villa Barbaro, and I'm just taking this as an example of one of these beautiful villas. Take a tour of the Palladian villas is just a wonderful thing to do. And this plaza area in the front, this is where they lay out the wheat to dry it in the sun. So these are working farmhouses, with the exception of this one, the Villa Rotunda. This is built for a retired clergyman, and it was a weekend retreat. And so this is where he would come to study, read his books, and also have parties. And this is Palladio's most famous building with its central dome. Here the dome is humanist. It's not marking the heavens or God, but rather marking where the human being stands. This is a study of a Palladian villa, and on the bottom we see a set of rules. So, looking at this is number one, grid. So Palladio sets up a grid. This tells him where the walls can go. He then chooses particular locations for the walls within that grid, which gives him his room layout. And finishing in the lower right, every door or window, there's a door or window opposite it in that room. So there are these rules that turn out to have a very calming, sort of rationalizing effect on the person in there, which is one of the reasons that Palladio's architecture is so wonderful, and then became so influential. So upper left, Lord Burlington's villa at Kent. On the upper right, Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. Lower left, George Washington's Mount Vernon. Lower right, National Gallery in Washington, D.C., all built under the influence of Palladio. And he did buildings in Venice and also Vicenza. Here's the Basilica in Vicenza, and very famous for what's called the Palladian window. If we look at the lower left, well, let's start with the photograph, and we see the evenness of this colonnade of rounded arches, But then we look in the lower left, look at the column and the wall. And what happened was he added this facade onto an existing building, and the grid was very irregular. And in order to keep the arches regular, notice the space between the column and the wall varies. So that allows him to provide an illusion of regularity dealing with this highly irregular situation. Very famous for that. This is Teatro Olimpico, and it's famous for its optical illusions. So look in the lower left, we see the stage, these to the back of the stage, these sort of boulevards extending off. Upper right, there's one of them, and we're looking down it so that we have this effective perspective, and they can use these in all kinds of dynamic ways in their theatrical presentations. So in Venice, we're going to see Church of Il Renditori, and we're not going to talk about that because San Giorgio Maggiore is a much better example for what we want to say. So here it is. You catch it by taking the water bus, hop on, hop off. Takes you right there, and coming in closer, you can see from here that there's the high central part of the nave, and then there's coming out from that lower down are the two side aisles. And the problem is, how are we going to put, so now Palladio is working within the classical orders, the Roman vocabulary. So how is he going to put a Roman temple front onto this irregular shape? And the answer is by using two Roman temple fronts. So he's got one in the center, high up, and then he has a wider one that's sort of tucked behind it. Looks like it is. It's just stuck on. Of course, it's just an applied facade. And then he has the problem that the central one, the columns are going to be way too long. You can't have columns that length. They would not be of correct proportions. So he sets those up on bases, and then on the far right and left, the columns, or the pilasters in this case, are able to come all the way down because this pediment is much lower. It says these two intersecting pediments. And here we see that it's the same configuration we saw earlier, upper left, on our Romanesque church. And then the problem was, how do we take a church like that and apply a Roman temple fronts to it? Inside, very white, very pure, quite handsome. And on the right, we won't go into details, but a very complex plan. My favorite Venetian building. On your way out, pick up the list of paintings and where you can see them. Some of these are in churches, etc. And you'll find the buildings in your guidebooks. Smile and be happy. You are in Venice. Thank you.